Cruise ship dumping has become a lightning rod topic because the ocean makes every leftover feel like a crime scene. And it's not just rumors. Princess Cruise Lines agreed to a $40 million criminal penalty for deliberate vessel pollution. And Princess plus its parent company Carnival later paid another $20 million for environmental probation violations. So when you leave fries on a plate, what really happens next? Let's trace it exactly. Why cruise ship dumping became a big topic. Cruises sit in a weird spotlight. You're floating in the middle of the ocean, you see endless food, and you don't see the back-of-house systems that make the ship run. So your brain fills the gap with the simplest theory. Well, they throw it overboard. Social media supercharges that theory. One blurry clip of a crew member tipping a bin or one angry caption, and suddenly every ship is dumping. The buffet becomes a prop in the story because it's the most visible symbol of excess. Then there's the trust problem. When real pollution cases hit the news, people stop giving the benefit of the doubt. They start assuming the worst, even when the rumor has nothing to do with leftover pasta or half-eaten dessert. The headline doesn't have to be about food for it to stain the entire idea of waste at sea. And finally, there's the rule book nobody talks about at dinner. Cruise ships don't operate in a legal vacuum. There are international standards, plus regional restrictions, plus port requirements, plus inspections. A ship isn't just deciding what's convenient. It's deciding what it can prove it did, what it can document, and what won't get it in trouble later. That's why this topic feels so emotional. You're not just asking, where does my leftover go? You're really asking, is this industry being honest with me when I can't see what's happening? So let's get very specific. Before we even talk about machines, ports, and what's allowed at sea, you need to understand one key split. Cruise leftovers are not one category. They are two, and they get treated very differently. The two kinds of cruise leftovers that change everything. Here's the split most people never make, and it's the reason cruise food waste feels so mysterious. On a ship, leftovers isn't one thing. It's two completely different streams, and they get treated like they came from two different worlds. First, plate waste. This is anything that reaches guests, even for a moment. Food on a buffet line, food served to a table, fries you carried back to your seat and didn't finish. Once it has been served and in a guest's possession, or even just placed on a buffet service line, it basically stops being food in the operational sense. It becomes a safety and compliance issue. That's why the reserve myth is mostly fantasy. The CDC's vessel sanitation program standards are blunt. Food that has been served or placed on a buffet line and then unused or returned can't be offered again for people to eat, with only narrow exceptions for certain protected, non-time temperature-controlled items. So when someone says, they just turn it into tomorrow's dinner, what they're imagining is illegal in most of the situations passengers are talking about. Second, galley waste. This is the stuff you never see. Prep trimmings, onion skins, vegetable ends, spoiled items caught before service, overproduction that never went out. This stream is cleaner and easier to manage because it hasn't been exposed to guests, and it's less likely to be mixed with random trash like napkins, wrappers, or cutlery. And that difference matters because contamination is the silent killer in waste handling. A tray of food scraps is one problem. A tray of food scraps with plastic, straws, and a few forks buried inside is a different problem. Once it's mixed, your options shrink. Now you can probably feel the direction this is going. Plate waste is the tricky one, and it can't just be reused. It has to be processed, contained, and handled as waste, which brings us to what happens next, behind the scenes when your plate disappears through that swinging door. Where your plate goes after the swinging door. Picture the moment your plate leaves your table. It doesn't go to the trash. It enters a workflow. First stop is the clearing station. Servers scrape and stack fast because the goal is speed and separation. Anything loose and edible looking gets pushed into the food waste stream. Anything that isn't food gets pulled out because one plastic wrapper or a hidden fork can ruin what happens next. Then it hits the dish area. This is the loud industrial heart of the ship's food operation. Trays, bus tubs, conveyor lines, racks sliding into steaming machines. It's not glamorous, but it's controlled. Waste can't just sit around. If it does, you get odor, pests, leaks, and a sanitation nightmare. That's why ships treat waste handling like a hygiene system, not a clean up later chore. Here's the part most passengers never imagine. The ship is constantly fighting contamination. Food waste needs to stay just food as much as possible, not because anyone wants to reuse it for guests, but because mixed garbage creates fewer legal and operational options. A bin of food scraps is manageable. A bin of food scraps mixed with gloves, napkins, straws, and packaging becomes a heavier, messier category that's harder to process, harder to store, and harder to offload cleanly in port. So ships build routine into it. Waste gets moved in sealed containers. Storage areas are designed to reduce smells and prevent pests. Everything is staged like it's part of inventory, because in a sense it is. You're managing volume, you're managing risk, and you're managing proof. That's why the dumping rumor spreads so easily. Passengers see abundance on one side of the door and nothing on the other side. But on the crew side, it's not a mystery. It's a logistics problem with strict rules attached. Now we can talk about the part people really want to know. Once food waste is separated and contained, how does a ship shrink it, stabilize it, and decide whether it gets offloaded in port or handled another way? The machines that shrink leftovers, and why that's the whole game. Here's the unglamorous truth. Leftover food is mostly water. Water is heavy, it smells fast, and it turns a little waste into a serious storage problem when you're feeding thousands of people every day. So the ship's first real goal isn't get rid of it, it's shrink it, stabilize it, and control it. That's why you'll hear cruise companies talk about volume reduction more than anything else. Carnival Corporation, for example, describes using hundreds of biodigesters and dozens of dehydrators and dryers across its fleet, saying those systems can reduce food waste volume by up to 90%. A biodigester is basically a food waste processor. In plain terms, it breaks down food into a slurry and separates out things that should never be in the system in the first place. This is also where the ship's obsession with no contamination shows up again, because plastic and food don't belong together, and nobody wants that mix ending up anywhere it shouldn't. Dehydrators and dryers do something simpler and often more effective. They pull out moisture. That one change makes waste lighter, less smelly, easier to store, and easier to hand off in port. Industry reporting describes dehydrators producing a mostly dry biomass output that is typically offloaded when the ship reaches port, and in some cases handled on board depending on the ship and itinerary. Notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying the ship turns leftovers into nothing. It turns leftovers into something manageable. And this is why, well, they must dump it at night, is usually the wrong mental picture. The ship is built to store and control waste as part of normal operations, because it has to operate under rules that assume discharge is the exception, not the default. MARPOL Annex 5 starts from a restrictive baseline and only allows limited specific discharges under specific conditions. Next, we need to talk about the part passengers almost never see, but ports take very seriously. What happens when the ship docks, and why a lot of food waste becomes a hand-it-to-a-licensed system on land problem rather than an ocean problem. Port day, when leftovers leave the ship. Here's the part that surprises people. A lot of leftover management isn't an ocean decision at all. It's a storage and handoff decision. Once food waste is separated and processed into something more stable, the ship can hold it in controlled spaces until docking. That means sealed containers, scheduled moves, and a very boring sounding reality: paperwork. Not because cruise lines love forms, but because waste is one of those categories where we did it right only matters if you can prove it later. If your itinerary touches the United States, the rules get even more intense for anything that looks like international catering waste. APHIS calls this regulated garbage, and it explicitly covers food scraps, table refuse, galley refuse, food wrappers and packaging, and other food-associated waste from vessels. It also makes a key point. If something is commingled with regular garbage, it becomes regulated garbage too. In other words, contamination doesn't just make a mess, it can legally change the entire waste stream. That's why ships care so much about keeping certain materials out of the food waste line. It's also why offloading is handled through approved processes and contractors, because APHIS requires specific handling activities to offload, transport, store, and process regulated garbage for disposal. Outside the U.S., the principle is the same. Ships are expected to operate under waste management plans and maintain records. Australia, for example, mandates garbage management plans and garbage record books for certain vessels, with inspections to verify compliance. And yes, mistakes still happen, which is why the dumping conversation never dies. In late 2025 reporting, Princess was fined in Australia after a ship discharged biodigestive garbage within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park boundaries, with the court hearing highlighting boundary awareness and discharge scheduling failures. Now that you've seen why ports matter so much, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is allowed at sea under international rules, and why the legal version is far narrower than people assume? What's actually legal at sea, and why just dump it is usually wrong. If a ship is close to land, the legal options collapse fast. That's the core reality. MARPOL Annex 5 starts from a strict baseline. Garbage discharge is generally prohibited, with limited carve-outs that include food waste under specific conditions. Here's the plain English version of the food rule. Outside special areas, food waste can only be discharged while the ship is en route and only be on set distances from the nearest land. If the food waste has been comminuted or ground so it can pass through a screen no larger than 25 millimeters, it can be discharged at 3 nautical miles or more from the nearest land. If it is not comminuted or ground, it can only be discharged at 12 nautical miles or more. Inside special areas, it gets tighter. The discharge of food waste is only permitted when it is comminuted or ground, not contaminated by other garbage, and only as far as practicable from land, but not less than 12 nautical miles. Now here's where viewers usually underestimate the difficulty. Nearest land is not always the beach you can see. Some regions have special boundary definitions that effectively push the compliance line outward. Australia, for example, notes an extended nearest land boundary around the Great Barrier Reef area. And it also flags additional biosecurity restrictions for international arrivals that can further limit what you can do with food waste on board. So even if something is technically permitted under the international framework, a cruise ship still has to ask a more practical question. Can we do this cleanly, consistently, and prove it later? That's why a lot of ships operationally prefer the boring route. Process the food waste to reduce volume, store it in controlled spaces, keep it uncontaminated, and offload it in port through approved systems. The ocean shortcut isn't a default. It's a narrow exception with distances, processing requirements, and documentation pressure wrapped around it. And with that rule book in your head, the next part lands harder. Those big enforcement stories aren't just drama. They're the reason ships obsess over logs, boundaries, schedules, and who is responsible for checking what. Because one missed detail can turn routine operations into a court date. The Princess's $40 million and Carnival's $20 million reality check. This is the moment where the conversation stops being internet panic and becomes, okay, the industry has a paper trail. Princess didn't get hit with that record penalty because a guest left pancakes on a plate. The DOJ case was about deliberate vessel pollution and the cover-up. Oil-contaminated waste discharged using an illegal bypass device that investigators and reporters commonly describe as a magic pipe. Plus, falsified records designed to make it look like everything was compliant. That's why the number sticks. $40 million isn't a whoops fine. It's a signal that regulators treat international discharge and falsifying logs as criminal conduct, not a customer service issue. Then came the part that matters for how ships operate today: probation and oversight. In 2019, Princess Cruise Lines and its parent company pleaded guilty to environmental probation violations and were ordered to pay a $20 million criminal penalty. If you want the simplest takeaway, it's this. The industry learned that we did the right thing means nothing unless you can prove it. Every day, in writing, with systems that don't depend on one person remembering the rules at 2 a.m. And it didn't stop being relevant. In 2022, the DOJ announced another probation-related action against Princess tied to violations during the court-supervised period. More evidence that enforcement doesn't end once the headline fades. So when you see all the strict routines around waste, separation, processing, storage, boundary checks, discharge schedules, that's not overkill. That's the compliance muscle memory built after very public consequences. Now here's the uncomfortable pivot. Even with perfect compliance, cruise ships still generate a lot of leftover food because the buffet model is designed around abundance, not precision. And that's where passenger behavior quietly changes the numbers more than most people want to admit. The buffet model creates leftovers before you even take a bite. Cruise ships don't overproduce because they're careless. They overproduce because the whole product is certainty. The guest experience is built on a promise that the food will still be there when you show up. But demand on a ship is chaotic. One port runs late and suddenly everyone eats at the same time. Weather flips an outdoor deck plan. A show ends and sends a wave of people to the buffet. Half the ship decides tonight is dessert night. The kitchen can't gamble and come up short, so it builds a cushion. That cushion becomes leftovers. And there's another factor passengers don't see. Once food is served to guests or sits on a buffet line, the ship has very limited safe options for what comes next. That's why just reuse it isn't the simple fix people imagine. The rules are strict for a reason. Now the uncomfortable part. Passengers shape waste more than they think, and it usually comes down to one small habit. Most buffet waste starts with this. You grab a plate before you've done a full lap. You're hungry. You see 10 options at once, and you make a fast choice. Then halfway down the line, you spot the thing you actually wanted. So you add it too. Then you sit down and realize you built a plate for 2 different moods. If you want to cut waste without ruining your vacation, here are 3 easy moves that actually work. First, do a look first lap. No plate, just scout. Second, take half portions. If you still want it, you can go back. On a ship, seconds are not a problem. Third, use made-to-order stations when you can. The portion is naturally tighter, and it tends to match what you truly want, not what looked good for 2 seconds under a heat lamp. This is not about guilt, it's about understanding the system. On land, leftovers can sometimes be managed quietly. On a ship, leftovers become a regulated, documented workflow. And that's why the next part matters. There are still myths people repeat like facts. Let's clear the biggest ones first. The myths that won't die, and the reality behind each one. Myth number 1. They dump everything at night. Reality? The ship can't treat waste like a nighttime secret. International rules restrict garbage discharge, with only limited exceptions, and food waste is only allowed under specific conditions tied to distance from land, processing, and being en route. That's why many ships default to processing and storage, then offloading in port through controlled systems. Myth number 2. The crew eats all the leftovers. Reality? There's a difference between unused, untouched food that never reaches guests and food that has been served or sat on a buffet line. Once it's been in guest service, reserving is heavily restricted. The CDC's Vessel Sanitation Program standards spell out that food that has been served or placed on a buffet line and then returned or unused generally can't be offered again for human consumption, with only narrow exceptions for certain protected, non-time temperature-controlled items. So yes, crews eat staff meals. Yes, ships try to manage surplus upstream. But your plate becomes crew dinner is not how the ship is allowed to run in the situations people mean. Myth number 3. They recycle leftovers into tomorrow's food. Reality? If we're talking about post-service food, that's basically the same myth wearing a different hat. The ship can sometimes repurpose ingredients before they're served, but once food has entered guest service space, the rules and the risk profile change completely. Again, the goal becomes safe disposal and compliance, not culinary creativity. Myth number 4. It's all handled perfectly because the cruise line says so. Reality. Cruise lines run serious systems, but enforcement history proves mistakes and misconduct happen, which is why the public is skeptical. The Princess case and later probation penalties are reminders that regulators don't just issue warnings. They prosecute when they believe conduct is deliberate or reporting is dishonest. So no, cruise ships aren't quietly sliding buffet trays into the ocean. Most leftovers become regulated waste that gets separated, processed to shrink volume, stored, and often offloaded in port under strict rules. If this helped, hit like and subscribe for more truth with zero fluff. And watch the next video on your screen. I picked it to save you money and stress on your next sailing. Your voyage is just beginning.